mission.
Let's get some insight now from Gerald Horne, Professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston. Welcome to the programme. So, can you tell us why has the British Prime Minister turned his attention to Africa?
He's turned his attention to Africa because he championed an ill-considered Brexit referendum that has disrupted trading relationships with his neighbors in the European Union. And now he showed up with his begging bowl in London, seeking to entice and coerce African nations to help save him from his own ill-considered maneuvers. Instead, it would have been highly appropriate if African leaders had asked him to apologize for decades, if not centuries, of British colonialism. You are speaking to a man, myself, who is the direct outgrowth of the criminal African slave trade that Britain pioneered for decades, if not centuries. I'm surprised that the leader of Kenya did not ask Mr. Johnson to apologize on behalf of Great Britain for the terror and torture inflicted upon Kenyan nationals in the 1950s and 1960s during the uprising against British settler colonialism. We all know that during the Thatcher years in the 70s and 80s, Britain was a major supporter of apartheid South Africa. And now he has the gall and temerity to invite African leaders to London to help him pull London's chestnuts out of the fire. I don't think it'll work.
So how significant of an impact will Britain's colonial past have on current ties?
It's not only Britain's colonial past, as your setup piece suggested. Mr. Johnson has made some rather racist comments about black people, not least black people in the city he used to lead, speaking of London. And then, of course, he made rather ill-considered comments about Kenya when Mr. Barack Obama was president of the United States, who happens to be of Kenyan origin and whose grandfather likely was tortured by the British authorities during the aforementioned Mau Mau revolt in Kenya in the 1950s and the 1960s. Mr. Johnson has a lot to apologize for. In fact, I'm not surprised that a citizen's arrest was not made of Mr. Johnson in his own London, and he should have been dragged to The Hague to stand trial before the International Criminal Court.
Do you think the African representatives will forgive him for his past comments? For example, in the past he called the continent a mess. And what other outcomes, or if any, do you expect to come out of this summit?
Well, compared to the summit that Russia held in Sochi or the numerous summits that China has held with African leaders, this comes up at best as in third place. We all know that China's bilateral trade with Africa is about 5 times the size of Britain's trade. Britain is trying to take advantage of the fact that in 2019, you had proclaimed the African Continental Free Trade Area, the attempt to establish a common market on the African continent from Cairo to the Cape. But I don't think that Britain's history, not to mention its present leadership, will allow it to gain any kind of traction in terms of challenging Russia and China in Africa.
Gerald Horne, Professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, thank you for your time.